On January 23, 1942, in Liverpool, England, a 19-year-old girl named Janet Okell finds herself standing inside a building that's been taken over by the military. She's staring at a floor that's been painted with a grid pattern. Every single square on that grid represents 1 nautical mile of the vast Atlantic Ocean. She's holding a piece of white chalk in her hand. All around her, senior officers from the Navy, men who've spent decades at sea, are watching with deep skepticism. They're about to discover something remarkable. This teenage girl, who has absolutely zero naval experience, is actually better at submarine warfare than they are. Captain Gilbert Roberts shifts uncomfortably, adjusting his collar. He knows exactly what's about to unfold. At 41 years old, he was invalided ashore 4 years earlier because of tuberculosis. Now he's been placed in command of something most admirals view as nothing more than a desperate joke. It's called the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, a wargaming center where, in their eyes, children are playing around with chalk, while Britain is literally drowning. But Roberts has noticed something crucial, something the Admiralty flat out refuses to acknowledge. Back in March of 1941, 41 merchant ships went down. By June, that number jumped to 61 ships. Then in November, 13 ships were sunk in just a single convoy. These numbers are telling a very clear story that senior officers simply will not accept. Everything the Royal Navy thinks it knows about fighting submarines is completely wrong. What Janet Okell doesn't know yet, what none of these teenage girls now gathering in this room have any idea about, is that within just 16 months, they're going to develop the very tactics that will turn around the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Admirals will actually make special trips to Liverpool just to be defeated by these girls in simulated combat. And by May of 1943, the chalk marks they make on a linoleum floor will force Admiral Dönitz to pull back his entire U-boat fleet in complete defeat. Winston Churchill will write these words years down the line. The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. But what he won't mention in his writings is this. Teenage girls armed with stopwatches are the ones who saved Britain from actual starvation. To truly understand why the Royal Navy desperately needed saving from its own mistakes, you need to grasp what was actually happening out in the North Atlantic during early 1942. The German U-boats weren't operating in the way that admirals had anticipated. They weren't attacking while submerged during daylight hours with their periscopes sticking up above the water. No, they were doing something that every textbook claimed was completely impossible. They were sneaking right into the convoys at night, staying on the surface, approaching from behind. They would infiltrate the columns of merchant ships, just like wolves moving among sheep, firing their torpedoes at point-blank range, and then diving down into the chaos before anyone could even react. By the time the escort ships figured out what was happening, 2 or 3 vessels would already be engulfed in flames. This wolfpack tactic proved brutally effective. U-boats would operate in groups ranging from 8 to 20 submarines, all coordinated by radio from Admiral Dönitz's headquarters over in France. One boat would locate a convoy and transmit its position. The pack would gather ahead of the convoy's route. Then they'd simply wait for darkness to fall and launch simultaneous attacks from multiple different directions. British convoy doctrine had been written for World War I-style tactics. Individual submarines attacking during the daytime. Escorts had been trained to protect against that specific threat, not this new nightmare. In January 1942, the Royal Navy had absolutely no coordinated response to these wolfpack attacks. Senior officers expected their captains to rely on experience and judgment to make decisions, to issue orders, to wait for those orders to be acknowledged and then executed. By the time that entire process was complete, the U-boats had vanished, and even more ships were dying. Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton, an escort commander who actually survived multiple wolf-pack attacks, later wrote something absolutely damning. He said our doctrine assumed we would have time to think. The Germans gave us only seconds to act. Men were dying while we sat there waiting for permission to fight back. Captain Roberts grasped the problem because he had spent 4 full years watching the Navy completely ignore it. Invalided ashore back in 1938, He'd been observing from the sidelines as the Admiralty prepared for entirely the wrong war. They had built more ships, they had developed better sonar, they had trained more sailors. But they hadn't questioned their most fundamental assumptions about how submarine warfare actually worked. Roberts put forward something truly radical: systematic tactical analysis using wargaming, not theoretical discussions held in conference rooms, actual simulations with real-time pressure and incomplete information, officers making split-second decisions under extreme stress, then seeing the outcomes calculated by assistants using naval tables and mathematics. The Admiralty gave him a building, they gave him a budget, and they gave him permission to try. What they didn't give him was experienced naval officers to actually run these simulations. Everyone who was qualified was already at sea, fighting the war. Roberts needed people who could calculate intercept courses, measure sonar ranges, track multiple moving targets all at the same time, and do all of this under intense time pressure. He needed the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. Janet Okell joined WATU in January 1942 when she was just 19. Her father was a prominent businessman in Liverpool. She had grown up privileged and educated, but she was completely unprepared for what Roberts was about to ask her to do: command submarines in simulated combat against senior naval officers. Jean Laidlaw arrived from Scotland. She had a background in chartered accountancy. Her mathematical precision was hidden behind a sense of humour that would lead her to name the first major tactical breakthrough raspberry, as in blowing a raspberry right at Hitler. The whimsy concealed calculations that were deadly serious. Laura Janet Howes, who everyone called Bobby, was born in Antigua. She was a mathematical prodigy whose computations would determine whether simulated escorts detected prowling U-boats or died in an ambush. Mary Wales was selected specifically because she understood team tactics from playing hockey. June Duncan would go on to become one of Britain's top fashion models in the 1950s, but in 1942 she was calculating intercept courses and depth charge patterns. The system Roberts designed was intentionally brutal. There was a floor painted with a grid. Players stood behind canvas screens that had peepholes cut into them. They couldn't see the full tactical picture, just like real convoy commanders scanning dark seas through binoculars. Wrens armed with coloured chalk became the hands of fate itself. Green marks represented U-boat movements, invisible to the players. White marks showed the escorts. Each mark got drawn and then erased as 2-minute turns ticked relentlessly past. There was no pause button, no ability to rewind. Make the wrong decision, and a chalk merchant ship simply vanished from the board, along with its notional cargo of food, fuel, and ammunition that Britain desperately needed to survive. Officers who were accustomed to measured, careful decisions now had exactly 120 seconds to issue their orders, while Wrens frantically computed the outcomes. Sonar detection ranges based on water temperature and sea state, torpedo run times accounting for target speed and bearing, star shell illumination patterns considering wind direction and cloud cover. The Royal Navy had completely neglected this kind of tactical study for 20 years. Now, Britain's very survival depended on making up for that neglect at emergency speed. The first simulations revealed something absolutely terrifying. Every single tactical doctrine the Navy taught its officers actually made things worse. When a torpedo struck, the standard procedure was for the senior escort officer to assess the entire situation, determine the threat axis, issue detailed orders to individual ships, and then coordinate a response. This whole process took anywhere from 8 to 12 minutes. During that time, U-boats firing from multiple bearings could sink 3 or 4 more vessels and submerge to complete safety. The Wrens, who were playing U-boat commanders, discovered this completely by accident. They weren't trained submariners. They were teenagers reading German tactical manuals and simply thinking about how they would attack if they commanded a wolf pack. Then they tested those tactics against British doctrine. They won, repeatedly, methodically, and brutally. From February through March of 1942, Wrens sank simulated convoys even faster than real U-boats were sinking real ships, because British escort doctrine was fundamentally, completely broken. Jean Laidlaw developed the breakthrough. She called it raspberry. The tactic was so incredibly simple it almost felt stupid. Upon a torpedo strike, the attacked ship immediately fires 2 white rockets skyward and transmits raspberry over the radio. Every single escort instantly converges on the convoy's perimeter and sweeps with star shells to illuminate the darkness. Any escort can initiate this, not just the senior officer, not after requesting permission, immediately. The innovation wasn't some new technology, it was permission. Permission for junior officers to act on their own initiative. Permission to abandon the rigid command hierarchy that allowed U-boats to exploit hesitation. When WATU tested raspberry in simulation, the results were absolutely dramatic. Response time dropped from 8 minutes down to 90 seconds. U-boats caught on the surface during their attack runs were suddenly illuminated by star shells, forced to crash dive before they could fire all their torpedoes. Escorts arrived at the perimeter while submarines were still submerging, with sonar contact, with depth charges ready. Roberts scheduled raspberry to be issued as official doctrine in May 1943. It got cancelled, because by that point it had worked so incredibly well that Dönitz had already changed German tactics, rendering it obsolete. Success arrived faster than the paperwork could. But before raspberry could reach the fleet, it had to survive one final, critical test. The test that would determine whether the Royal Navy took WATU seriously or shut it down as a complete waste of resources. In November 1942, Admiral Max Horten became Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. He was a submarine ace from World War I, with a well-earned reputation for aggressive tactics and zero tolerance for nonsense. Horten could have ended WATU with a single word. Instead, he visited Liverpool to see Roberts' operation for himself. Wrens, Janet Okell and Jean Laidlaw were assigned to demonstrate the beta search tactic by playing U-boat commanders hunting an inbound convoy. Admiral Horten took personal command of the escort group. What happened next became absolute legend within WATU. Over the course of that morning, these teenage girls sank him 5 separate times. They identified his patterns, they exploited his assumptions, they anticipated his responses, and they ruthlessly punished every single mistake. Horten, a man who had commanded submarines in actual combat and sunk enemy warships, was completely outmaneuvered by women young enough to be his daughters, girls who had never been to sea, who had learned submarine warfare from manuals and simulations, who thought about tactics as mathematics and probability rather than experience and intuition. After the 5th defeat, Horten stood up from the plotting table and looked directly at Roberts. "This works," he said. "How many officers have you trained?" "About 200 so far, sir. Not enough. I want every escort commander in Western Approaches Command through this facility. 50 officers per week. Continuous training until we've processed the entire fleet." Horten became WATU's most powerful advocate. After the war ended, he stated flatly that Captain Roberts and his staff contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Horten's predecessor, was even more direct. He said, "You had a great deal to do in winning the war, because if we hadn't won the Battle of the Atlantic, we should undoubtedly have lost the war." From February 1942 to July 1945, WATU trained 5,000 officers from the UK, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, Poland, and Free France. They arrived weekly, 50 at a time, for intensive courses that compressed months of hard-won tactical lessons into just days of simulated combat. The training was deliberately humbling. Officers commanding destroyers and corvettes, men who had survived depth charge attacks and torpedo hits, found themselves completely outmaneuvered by women young enough to be their daughters. The lesson was pointed. U-boat commanders were smart, aggressive, and adaptive. Tactics that worked last month were obsolete this month. Rigid adherence to doctrine would absolutely get you killed. Initiative, speed, and coordination were everything. By mid-1942, officers who passed through Liverpool returned to sea with a shared tactical vocabulary and doctrine. When convoys came under attack, scattered escorts could coordinate their responses without lengthy radio exchanges. They knew the drills. They had practiced against opponents who thought like U-boat aces, because they had been trained by Wrens who had studied every single German tactic and counter-tactic. The impact showed clearly in the statistics. But first, things got much worse. March 1943 was the absolute worst month of the war for Allied shipping. Between 95 and 120 merchant ships were lost in the Atlantic and Arctic, 2/3 while sailing in convoy, the supposedly safest formation. The Royal Navy seriously questioned whether convoy as a defensive system remained viable at all. The Admiralty recorded that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communication between the New World and the Old. Britain had exactly 3 months of food supplies remaining. If the loss rate continued at this pace, the island would starve before summer ended. Churchill's government began planning for a negotiated peace. Then came May 1943. In a single month, 41 U-boats were lost while sinking only 13 merchant ships, nearly 1-to-1 exchange rates that were absolutely catastrophic for Germany. On May 23rd and 24th of 1943, Grand Admiral Admiral Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, admitting defeat in the campaign's decisive theatre. Multiple factors contributed to this victory. Very long-range Liberator bombers closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers provided air cover where land-based planes simply couldn't reach. Centimetric radar detected surfaced U-boats beyond visual range. Hedgehog forward, throwing mortars eliminated the sonar blind spot that depth charges created. But the tactics that allowed escorts to use these tools effectively came from a linoleum floor in Liverpool, developed by women the Admiralty had initially viewed as just clerks and plotters. How to coordinate searches, when to illuminate targets, which unit pursues while others guard the convoy. WATU didn't just develop Raspberry. They created an entire tactical arsenal. Pineapple countered Wolfpack attacks with 2-mile-wide zigzag patterns and selective starshell use. Just enough light to spot U-boats without illuminating the convoy as a target. Banana replaced Raspberry for single U-boat attacks with coordinated sweeps using the latest radar and sonar. Beta Search located shadowing U-boats by assuming their most likely course based on convoy movements. Counterintuitive, but it worked. Step Aside was developed in just 3 days after the first German acoustic torpedo strike on convoy ONS 18 inches September 1943. 2 minutes at full speed toward the attacking U-boat, then a 60-degree turn for 3 minutes. The maneuver pulled escort screws outside the acoustic torpedo's tracking cone long enough to lose the lock. Each tactic was stress-tested in the linoleum laboratory dozens of times before being issued to the fleet. Each was refined based on feedback from officers who survived encounters at sea and returned to Liverpool to describe what actually happened versus what the wargame had predicted. U-boat commanders reported to Admiral Dönitz that convoy escorts were executing coordinated responses impossibly quickly, because WATU had trained them to act on initiative rather than wait for orders from senior officers. The Wolfpack tactic depended on exploiting the confusion and communication delays inherent in 1940 and 1941 convoy operations. By 1943, those delays had been completely eliminated. German hydrophone operators who had been tracking convoys from 40 kilometers away suddenly couldn't find targets until escorts were practically on top of them. Not because of some new technology, because some merchant ships had been fitted with acoustic dampening systems. That innovation came from an entirely different, unlikely source. A 28-year-old American merchant ship cook named Thomas Tommy Lawson, who noticed something strange about the way Liberty ships sounded underwater. But that's a different story altogether. The point is that the same pattern repeated throughout 1942 and 1943. Unlikely people solving critical problems. Initial rejection from the authorities, eventual validation through field testing, rapid implementation saving thousands of lives. Then the historical erasure of the innovators' contributions. WATU's role remained classified for decades after the war ended. The Wrens, who developed Raspberry, Pineapple, and Beta Search, returned to civilian life without any recognition. Janet Okell, who commanded simulated destroyers at 19, disappeared into post-war obscurity. Jean Laidlaw's name appears in very few histories. June Duncan's modelling career overshadowed her tactical innovations. Captain Gilbert Roberts received some acknowledgement, but even his role was significantly downplayed. The narrative that emerged emphasized technology, radar, sonar, hedgehog, aircraft, hardware made for much better post-war stories than teenage girls with chalk and stopwatches. Simon Parkin's 2019 book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, finally gave WATU its proper due, based on archival research and surviving records. The operational documents survived, but the voices of the women who made the decisions largely did not. Unlike their male counterparts, very few Wrens wrote memoirs or gave interviews. The culture that employed their brilliance also silenced their stories. There's a broader lesson here about innovation under institutional pressure. Every breakthrough from 1942 to 1943 followed the exact same arc. Stage 1. Rejection. Military and scientific establishments dismissed innovations that challenged doctrine or threatened established hierarchies. Admirals scoffed at teenage girls doing tactics. Stage 2. Advocate intervention. Each innovation survived because a single senior officer or scientist risked their reputation to force field testing. Admiral Horton for WATU. Stage 3. Validation. Field testing proved effectiveness beyond any argument. WATU trained officers won the Battle of the Atlantic. Stage 4. Rapid scaling. Once proven, production ramped from prototype to mass deployment in just months. 5,000 officers trained at WATU. Stage 5. Historical erasure. Decades passed before the public learned these stories. The Wrens of WATU vanished into post-war life. The pattern suggests institutional bias isn't incidental, it's structural. Military hierarchies evolved to enforce standardization and discipline, making them inherently conservative. The same institutions that enable coordinated operations at scale also suppress the decentralized innovation required for tactical and technological breakthroughs. The admirals who spent entire careers mastering naval warfare couldn't accept that teenagers with chalk might see patterns they had completely missed. In 1942, Britain faced an existential threat. Ships were burning. The mathematics of starvation were simple and absolutely terrifying. The innovations that changed those outcomes came from people the system initially dismissed. Invalid officers, teenage girls, people willing to question what everyone knew was true. Janet Okell commanded imaginary destroyers at 19 and vanished into history. The Wrens of WATU won the Battle of the Atlantic and returned to civilian life without recognition. The institutions they served survived because they succeeded. The question their stories pose is this: did those institutions learn anything from nearly losing everything to enemies less dangerous than their own certainty? The tactical analysis methodology Gilbert Roberts developed at WATU influenced naval warfare doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. But the broader lesson remains unlearned by most organizations most of the time. The Wrens who beat the U-boats proved that teenage girls with chalk could outthink experienced admirals. 80 years later, most institutions still wouldn't believe it until they actually saw it, and most still wouldn't see it even then. What impossible problems could be solved today if we stopped assuming the experts have all the answers?